or do you want to do full screen?
It could be makes a difference.
Okay, so this is so confusing because I'm the opposite side.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. I believe we are now live, so once again I will welcome, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Rabbinic Chavrusa in memory of Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzedek Livracha. I'm here this evening. It is an honor to be in the shul of Rabbi Baruch Davis in Chigwell, and we are going to discuss tonight the faith in the future. Now, I have to say that I've never been in Chigwell shul, and I feel very close to you, Rabbi Davis, and being here in the shul. The first time we met was at the consecration for Percy Son.
That's right.
Now, Percy Son, a honorary life president here at the shul. I want to give a shout out to Percy Son's wonderful, wonderful son, David. David, I think, high in Spain somewhere. But David, you have been an incredible... David is not quite front and center as his dad, Zichron Livracha, in terms of community leadership, but the amount of incredible, extraordinary work for the community and to help people that David does behind the scenes is unparalleled as far as anybody that I have met. And no doubt it's a tribute to his father, Zichron Livracha. And I want to say as well, so that was the first time you and I met. The first time I met your Rebbetzin was actually in Australia. You and your family knew my family in Australia before we met. So
That's absolutely right. We visited them in Sydney in 1994.
right. So I happened to be at my parents' shul at one point when your wife was there. I don't even know if she was there for a simcha or something.
A family wedding.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So wonderful. But here we are this evening in Chigwell. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for being my chavrissa this evening. And tonight we're discussing faith in the future. But before we do, Rabbi Davis, tell me about your relationship with Rabbi Lord Sachs, zt'l.
So, in a sense, it goes back a very long way. But first of all, Rabbi Friedman, it's an incredible pleasure to be doing this project with you. And welcome to Chigwell and Hainaut Synagogue. It's fantastic to have you here. So, I actually first heard Rabbi Sachs speak in 1976.
Wow.
I was in the sixth form at Hasmonean, and I took up an invitation along with some friends to go and spend Shabbos at Jews College, which was then in Montague Place in town. And on Shabbos afternoon, we were introduced to this young, aspiring rabbi. He was, I think, a student at that time. I'm not sure if he had yet had smicha. And honestly, I don't remember what he said 45 years ago. But what I do remember is sitting up and saying, this is different. I wonder what's going to be in the future. And it really left an impression on me, and therefore it wasn't surprising when I heard some years later that he had taken smicha, he'd taken on a rabbinical position, and then his position in Jews College. But the next time I heard him speak was possibly a few years later in Kingsbury. He came as a guest speaker. I grew up in Kingsbury, but I left in 1981, so there wasn't much room for margin. But after that, he and I happened to be in Jerusalem at the same time in February 1991. That's the Gulf War. And he was giving it all. He'd been appointed chief rabbi, but not yet taken up position. And he had been asked to give a talk. I think it was at the OU Center. And it was during curfew, but you were sort of allowed out during the missiles. And I was one of those when I was very interested to hear what he had to say. I'd already been 3 years in the position in Adelaide, and I was very eager for some, if you like, some new material. And of course, he didn't disappoint. Subsequent to that, he spoke in Australia.
Well, wait a second. I have to stop you there.
Yes.
Because he, of course, his famous story from those days is when he was the only one in the country to shave his beard for the gas mask. Did you have a beard in those days, Rabbi Davis?
I had a beard and I decided not to shave. But my brothers in Israel did shave. Yes, you're absolutely right. It was a point of contention at the time.
So Rabbi Sachs made it out to Adelaide?
No, he made as far as Melbourne,
Okay.
and I got on a plane to hear him speak.
So that must have been, I was a rabbi in Sydney at the time, so that must have been about 96, 97.
I actually thought a bit earlier than that.
Okay.
Um,
Maybe there was an earlier.
I think it was an earlier
Time.
visit, and if you came later, I think we were probably already in England by that time.
Right, right.
Since coming to Chigwell and Hainault, he's been a constant source of inspiration, and it's an awful thing. I knew that he had inspired me in many different ways, but only after he passed did I reflect on the fact that in many ways he defined my rabbinate.
Really, how so?
Because, for several reasons, really. One was general, that it was just incredibly inspiring to listen to the messages that he gave on contemporary issues, on whether of Jewish learning, whatever it was, he said it in a way that it could be heard. And I'm sure I'm not alone amongst the rabbinate that said we listened and we learned and we taught what we had learned. That's on one level. But there was another level. And that is, we had his phone number to be used in time of extreme need. And I never wanted to use it because I never wanted to bother him. But on 2 occasions, I felt I had no choice. One of them was Erev Sukkot 2000, the year of the Intifada. The time was when the 2 Israeli reserve soldiers were brutally lynched in Ramallah. And it was Erev Sukkot. And I really thought to myself, what am I going to say in my sermon on Sukkot? It's Zman Simchas Seinu, the festival of our rejoicing. What am I going to say? Because I don't feel like rejoicing. And he taught me a message then that I have never forgotten. Baruch, our job is to inspire hope. We have got through worse, we will get through this. Never ever become despondent. We will come through this and we will win. That is the message that you have to convey. And that is the message that I conveyed. A second time was a few years later. We had a bar mitzvah in the shul. And some of you watching will remember this. It was a big tragedy. 3 days before the bar mitzvah, the boy came to practice, having got up from Shiva that morning for his mother, Oleh Shalom. And the practice was heartbreaking. And I phoned Rabbi Sachs, and I said, Rabbi Sachs, what am I going to say? They're all going to be wondering, what's he going to say? What can he possibly say? And the parsha was Vayechi. And I said to Rabbi Sachs, well, Vayechi, you know, Yaakov didn't really die and all the rest of it. He said, maybe, but I think there's another message from Parshas Vayechi, which he shared with me. And just by the way he told it to me, it's crystal clear in my mind today, many years later. I think it's about 15, 16 years ago. And the message was this. Joseph said to his brothers, he's about to die. The day will come when God will take them out of Egypt, and they are to take his bones with them for burial in the land of Israel. Say to the boy, in the same way that the Jewish people took Joseph's bones with them, you will take your mother's memory, legacy with you wherever you go, and whatever you do, she'll be an inspiration for you. He also wrote a beautiful letter to the boy for me to read out in shul.
Wow, how powerful. and how much it shows what a human rabbi he was. Sometimes, we don't, we hear these stories of Rabbi Sachs as the great scholar, the great leader, but he was a rabbi.
So on a different occasion and in a different context, one of our sons had the bar mitzvah, actually two of them, but he was able to come to one of them, had the bar mitzvah Sunday Rosh Chodesh. And he called up and he said, "Can I come?" What a question. He came and he spoke. I still remember his drasha that morning. But what I even more remember is that at the end of the service, he put his arm around me, gave me a big hug. He said, "Baruch, it's such a pleasure to celebrate with you and your kehillah. What a wonderful shidduch." And so that was really the human touch.
Absolutely. Wow.
So these were a number of incidents, but he was also there ready to come. You need me. You want me to launch something? I'll come. In 2008, we launched a major education project in our shul. It lasted for several years. We called it L'chaim. And he came and he spoke at the opening evening. 200 people piled into the shul, and it got off to a fantastic start. And he was really ready and happy to do that. So on the one level, yes, he was right up there amongst the top, the greatest academics in the world. But on the other hand, he was there for his rabbis.
Right.
And you'll recall we had a few days after he passed away, we, Rabbanim and Rebbetzins, had a Zoom call, and I felt we were all sitting shiva. And we were reminiscing. And I realized that I was far from being alone. In fact, everyone of our colleagues had stories to tell, and I was particularly struck by the younger ones who came in as a group in the last 2 years of his chief rabbinate. And as one of them said, he could have been forgiven for saying, "You know what, I'm winding down." But no, he wanted to give them as much as possible. He set up a regular learning meeting with them, and he really set them up. And they're just doing such great stuff today. And they will say it is no small part due to the inspiration that he gave them. Not just the inspiration, but the wise words that he gave them in the early years of their rabbinate.
Because of course, as chief rabbi, he you think his final couple of years as chief rabbi, he was hardly winding down. It was just a warm up for his whole next stage of his life. So
For sure.
Let's talk about faith in the future. It's one of his earlier books. You've chosen this particular idea to discuss this evening. What is it about this book that you like, Rabbi Davis?
So, faith in the future. There are two words here which are key. One is faith and the other is future. And in fact, he had faith in the future, but it wasn't just a blind faith. He talked about the word faith. He talked about it as it appears in Modeh Ani, the prayer we say we get up every morning. I thank you, Hashem, for restoring my soul to me. Rabba emunatecha, great is your, and he would translate it as faithfulness. Faithful. God has faith in us, that we will be faithful to what we're supposed to do. That's faith in the future. In other words, we're building towards a future. Not faith in the future, we'll sit back and I'm sure everything will be all right. Not at all. But it's the kind of faith that I am going to make it all right. I'm going to do my part. And this book is about that. It's about how we go from being what he portrays. 1995, he portrays Britain as a broken society. There's a lot of Judaism in the book, as you'd expect, but actually he's talking about Britain, democratic Britain, having moved from more a collective approach to life under a number of, should we say, Labour governments, and then to a more individualistic type of approach under the Conservative government, and he says neither has worked. And now we're in a mess. What should we do? And again, faith in the future. He doesn't write it in this book, but we know from other conversations that he's taken a message from Rav Soloveitchik, zt'l, one of the two great men that he visited in his trip to America, famous trip to America in, I think it was 1967, 1968. And he learned from Rav Soloveitchik the following: you can have a disaster. It can be really terrible. You can feel it's gorali, oh, that is my lot. And that's what I have to put up with. Or you say, what then must I do? Which Rav Soloveitchik called Brit Yud. Rabbi Sachs, in this book, it's not just to say we are broken. It is, what then should we do? And the truth is, some of the messages that come out of the book, I think were not only well received, but in part have probably been implemented by successive, not just governments, but communities.
Right. I mean, indeed. I mean, just the introduction here from Clifford Longley that I believe you'd like to discuss. Just to let everybody know the format of what we'll be doing is we'll look at various chapters and summarize them and then discuss them. And I want to thank the members of Chigwell who have joined us here this evening. We will have some time for questions at the end, and obviously we'll repeat the questions because you won't hear it through the mic. We want to make sure that all of our virtual viewers can hear it as well. And thank you to all of you from Chigwell, Hampstead Garden Suburb, and across England and beyond for joining us here this evening. So let's start. Tell me the introduction with Clifford Longley. What was it that you wanted to, that really caught your eye there?
Do you know what it is? And this was reflected in some of the tributes to Rabbi Sachs after his passing. Clifford Longley also portrays in his introduction the difficulties that Britain was going through at the time. And he says, allow me to introduce a new voice in our society, not from the normal places, but an Orthodox Jew. Yes, the chief rabbi, but an Orthodox Jew. And Orthodox Judaism has something to say about our situation. He is Orthodox, he's committed to the Jewish way of life, observances, he's committed to Israel, and yet he's very much an Englishman. And he speaks our language. We have much to learn from him. And if we don't, we will be the poorer for it. What an incredible introduction. And really, his was the first of many non-Jewish voices to say, this is a man from whom we can learn and we must learn. And we know, we the Jewish community know, how proud we felt when Rabbi Sachs spoke in front of a non-Jewish audience, when he stood up in the House of Lords and he made what would often be the moral case for whatever was going on in society at that time. One can only imagine what he would have had to say this week and last week about the situation in Afghanistan.
Maybe we can get to some of that a little later, because I think there are many themes here that do speak to those. But absolutely, one can count on one hand the number of rabbinic figures that we have had in our history who have had that voice. We're looking at the likes of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who had a personal relationship with Antoninus. We're thinking of the Rambam, who, personal physician in Egypt, but probably much more than that. But of course, Don Isaac Abarbanel, who politician, and so much more. One of our greatest rabbis ever. And Rabbi Sachs fits that lineage and, very much up there in terms of one of the greatest. We think, well, he was the chief rabbi here, he was in our generation. No, this is the likes of which we have seen very few in our entire history. So let's get right into the book. I'm going to start with chapter 7, which is a discussion of law, morality, and the common good. Now, Rabbi Sachs talks about minimalist law versus maximalist law. So in minimalist law, he starts with a Jewish formulation of it given by Rabbi Hanina ben Trajan, who says that pray for the welfare of the government, for if not for the government, Israel chaim b'loi. Each person would swallow one another up. And he says, at a bare minimum, the reason that we are happy that we have a legal system is just so people can be protected in their own domain. But that's a very minimalist, that says nothing more than so that we don't kill each other. But he says that doesn't develop as an idea, really, at least insofar as our modern way of thinking, until John Stuart Mill. On liberty essentially is that minimalist position that says all the law should do is allow everybody their personal freedoms to do no harm. As long as everyone is committed to doing no harm, and that's what the law protects, that's all the law societally needs to achieve. He then contrasts that with what's really the Jewish position, is the maximalist position, whereby law permeates every aspect of who we are and what we do, to the extent that it's not even us. Law even binds the Almighty. So we have examples in the Torah of Avram Avinu, who's arguing with the Almighty, saying, how could you do this to Sodom and Gomorrah? We have Moshe Rabbeinu, who says, if you're going to do this to the children of Israel, erase me. Right? God himself is bound by the law, and the law dictates everything. But the way that we understand the law, you don't have to wait to get to law school to be educated in the law from our traditional perspective. We start right at the beginning. V'shinantam levanecha, teach them to your children. V'dibartabon, speak of them. The law, Torah, is something that we weave into the very fabric of who we are. But he says what that achieves is that it becomes so natural that this is our basic moral code without thinking twice. We have this accepted way of doing things that we're all speaking the same language. And when you're all speaking the same language, it's not that we have to question, well, should we be doing this or shouldn't we be doing this? This is how we've all been brought up. Now, coming at that from certainly even from John Stuart Mill's perspective, but particularly now because he gets even more concerned about this as time goes on through his books, all the way to his latest morality book, and he's talking about postmodernist ways of looking at this. But already here, he's already well aware that this is the direction that the world is going in, that says that, well, why should we inculcate our children in any moral code? Because who's to say that one way of doing things is better than any other way of doing things? So we're going to have, be it Jewish values, or like you said, Rabbi Davis, he's really talking to a wider audience, is using Judaism as a model for a wider audience, in this case, British values. To be able to say, why inculcate anything in our children? Because who's to say that that's the right way and that's not the right way? Who's to say that one moral way of doing things versus another form of morality is the right moral code? Let's just say everybody should be able to do whatever they think is right, and you have no right to tell me that my way of living my life, my lifestyle, is any better or worse than your prescription of what the good moral life is. He says, here's the problem. He says, when we take that, it looks good on paper to be able to say we don't need a common moral code, we don't need a common moral legal system, but ultimately it's going to have repercussions. I'll just give one example. He gives many examples. I'll give one example. He says, let's say, who's to say that life in a family of mother, father, and children is the best way to live. Maybe it's not. Maybe monogamy is not necessarily, it's based on our Judeo-Christian values, but who's to say it's the right way? Maybe everything is equally right, and children can be born out of wedlock, and we shouldn't judge, and the consequence of which will be that children may grow up in single-parent families, probably most of the time single mothers who are having to work overtime, and these children end up having less parent time, and unfortunately, because we see that we have evidence for it, those children tend more to end up in criminal situations, and then it ends up impacting society and the state. And so now we need more policing, we need a greater legal system, because we didn't inculcate a certain moral code in the beginning. We said anything goes. So in this chapter, he says, morality, there needs to be some sort of agreed morality, agreed collective value system. And whatever that is, we believe in inculcating that into our children. It's law that equals education, equals who we are as a nation. And when we do that, then we can lay the foundation so that we don't have problems later. Your thoughts on some of those ideas?
Well, this is, of course, a theme that permeates the book. And one of the comments that I think he makes in this chapter is that, of course, this is to be that the objection to having one system or to thinking my way is better than your ways, you are being judgmental. And today that is unfortunately very much in vogue. And as you correctly say, he anticipates that. But he does point out the likely outcome of such a situation where each person does what they do. It's very interesting, though, this point, and it really gets to the heart of it, because elsewhere he focuses on the fact that prior to the Exodus, 3 times, as if they've got nothing else to think about when they're leaving the terrible slavery of Egypt, suddenly God is concerned about, what are you going to tell your children? And that is a message that he's giving over. What are you going to tell your children about slavery, about the right way to act, about the deliverance, about gratitude? What are you going to tell them? And that is critical. And just the fact that children are mentioned 3 times in that episode is a clear statement that when you tell your children things, they are inculcated, and then you say, just taken as normal. So he has pointed out many times that do not oppress a stranger because you are strangers in the land of Egypt. How many times that's said in the Torah? I think the answer is 36. Incredible. Incredible. That is a message. And we pride ourselves as a people on being kind to strangers. That is something that is part of us. And it stemmed from that time. So his chapter is, on the one hand, yes, it's a Jewish experience, but what can society as a whole learn from that experience?
Absolutely. So I think you're going straight into the following 2 chapters, chapters 8 and 9. Tell us what Rabbi Sachs has to teach us.
Well, chapter 8 is on faith in the community. And I just scribbled down a few notes just to remind myself. But as we said earlier, that in the 1980s, the move away from collectivism to individualism was very, very strong, and neither worked. Collectivism, the problem with that was it inhibited growth, and you need growth in the economy to pay for state services. So the country was close to bankruptcy under a more collective approach. But the individualism led to high unemployment, greater disadvantages, crime, and ethnic tensions. Interestingly, I just insert a note here. He couldn't have written this at the time because it was too early. But I joined a rabbi's trip several years ago to the Ukraine. We visited the Jewish community in the eastern Ukraine, not far from the conflict. And we had a fascinating discussion with a group of older Ukrainian Jews. And we were in one of these awful Soviet-era blocks, which were very, very ugly, but be that as it may. We asked them, is life better now that the communists have gone, or was it better then? And we were astounded to hear them say, we don't know. Yes, it was rather oppressive under the Soviets, but we all knew we had a salary, we had a place to live, and we had food to eat. What happened when that broke down was that a few people took great advantage, the oligarchs, they didn't use that word, but we use that word now. They made incredible wealth, but many people actually slipped lower into below the poverty line. So they said, we don't know. Rabbi Sachs, in his book, wrote his words before that had really taken place fully in the Ukraine and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. He was talking about this country, but you can see that that is what has happened. Higher unemployment, higher crime levels, and also ethnic tensions. So he said there has to be a third way. And the third way is what he calls community. What's a community? He defines community as a voluntary association of people larger than the individual and smaller than the state. It can be a family or a religious congregation, charitable organization, neighborhood watch even. That's community. And in the community, and it's quite similar to the message, Rabbi Friedman, that is coming out of the previous chapter, in the community we acquire the virtues that sustain our common life. Duty, honesty, service, self-sacrifice, integrity, neighborliness, fortitude, and civility. All these things which are so necessary, you will not get from, as long as they don't harm anyone else. But what happened was that the shift to individualism actually eroded community life. It led to an increase in poverty, homelessness, broken families, drugs, and violence. Worst of all, he says, a loss of meaning and hope. We said earlier, this is one of his big things, hope. And if hope is lost, we're in a bad place. So he said it was taken for granted that liberty, democracy, and the free market were built on moral foundations larger than self-interest. They are sustained by the family and other institutions and traditions, which then humanize the effects of competition, and they counterbalance its unequal rewards. So within a community, we know, I just interject here my own comment, that we know within the Jewish community, and especially the last year and a half, we have been on the lookout for those really suffering under the pandemic. We've done our best, not just here in Chigwell and Hainault, but right across, I'm sure, the Jewish world. We've been looking out, trying really hard to make sure that those who are falling don't fall, but are saved from that fall. That's what a community does. That's what any community do. So he says, let's not think about so much about liberty versus equality, but more on fraternity. Let's not think so much about our rights, but more our duties. Let's not think so much about justice, but on citizenship, an environment where civic virtues are practiced and learned. So we need, he says, a covenant. Covenant of what? Commitment to the common good. And then he says something which we know is so true from our own community. Our diverse talents, traditions, and gifts can be pooled for the common good to make Britain a community of communities. What the state can do is to encourage and to enable. No wonder Clifford Longley liked this book.
Now, I'm pondering your connection to the pandemic and how well we have done as communities. And I think about people who are not part of communities and how difficult it must have been, especially if they were shut in, especially if they couldn't go shopping, especially if they were elderly and they were shielding, and who did their shopping? And who called them? And what's amazing is that Rabbi Sachs could already view, without needing a pandemic, to be able to sense that this is what works. And I think now we need to ask ourselves, so at least now that we've seen it in action, we've seen what he's talking about play out, so how do we extract that out beyond our communities? Because we know what it's working for us. We know it's always been working for us, and we're doing okay. I mean, it's not perfect, nothing's perfect, but relative, I think he wants to use our model to be able to help society or the nation more generally. I don't know if we would have known how to do that until now. But now that we've seen it and now that we've identified it, so what are we going to do about it?
So what is interesting, and in fairness, one of the words that I've come across a lot on the news, we're talking about the pandemic, especially the first 6 months or so, actually is the word community, and I don't mean Jewish community. There have been entire neighborhoods in this country that have got together to support those in need, to go and get their shopping, go and get their prescriptions. We're proud of what we've done as a community, but we're not alone. And one of the really nice things is people have watched out for each other. I can even say in our road, there's Mount Pleasant Road, the name of our road, Neighborhood Watch. And for a time when things were really bad, the message went out on our neighbours' WhatsApp group. If anyone needs help, please don't hold back. We want to help. And this came to full expression one night where it's actually turned out to be one of our members, became aware that there was a suspicious person trying to get in to the upstairs. And a message was sent out on the WhatsApp group. Within seconds, the neighbours from around the street were out of their houses, running to that house, and the intruder ran off. That's community. And it's not the kind of thing that makes the news. But I think Rabbi Sachs would have been very pleased at some of the developments that have happened during the pandemic, outside the Jewish community as well as in.
Oh, it's good to hear that people are coming together, and maybe it wasn't possible before WhatsApp groups, and it certainly was possible, but the Almighty has given us certain ways to facilitate and ease our ability to be able to operate as communities.
Yeah.
So we are now going to chapter 17. And Rabbi Sachs discusses democracy as a Jewish value. And I think this is where some of the issues of the past couple of weeks, I think, really express themselves or manifest themselves. So is democracy a Jewish value? One would think that as far as religion is concerned, religious ideals probably speak to theocratic values. I mean, certainly the way the media would like to label Chief Rabbi in Israel even as insisting on businesses being closed on Shabbat or certain streets, or it seems almost theocratic. But he says that's just not the case. He says Judaism does not have a chosen political system. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant what he does with this. His first piece of evidence is the parsha that deals with the giving of the Torah. That parsha is called Yitro. And the first thing we learn in that parsha is how to facilitate a legal system. And where do we learn that legal system? Is it in the Torah? No, not in the Torah. Some non-Jew shows up the day before we receiving the Torah, and says, by the way, Moses, you're doing it all wrong. This is not how we do legal systems. You're going to burn out in 2 weeks' time. You're going to have a system of lower courts and upper courts. Was that a Jewish system? Is that a Jewish ideal? No, it was a non-Jew. Because, says Rabbi Sachs, the reason it's placed in the same Torah, the Torah juxtaposes Yitro's legal system with the Torah's guide and says, there are a lot of things that happen in this world. Some of them we learn from the Torah, others we learn from the society around us, and the Torah value is, how do we use the Torah as a prism to judge whether this is an effective idea or not? And he says politically. Politically, we had it in the Torah a couple of weeks ago. Pasha Shoftim. If you get into the land and you say, well, we'd like to have a king like everyone else. Sure enough, we get into the land, we've settled the land, we turn to the prophet Samuel and we say, we want a king like everyone else. And he rails against him and says, what are you doing? Why would you want a king? And the commentators already in the Gemara, Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Nahirai, discussing, is this ideal, is this not ideal? Are we meant to have a king? Why is he railing against them? The Torah already says if they want a king. But if we look at that formulation, it's, if you want a king, is it a mitzvah? It's not a mitzvah. Rabbi Sachs says, it's neither here nor there. That's not the question. The question isn't, is it good or bad? The question is, what do we do with it once we have it? So in that case, it's a monarchic system. If you want to have a king, then this is how you do it. He shouldn't have too many wives, shouldn't have too much gold and silver. These are the limits that we place on a king should you want to have a system of monarchy. He says the same thing for democracy. Democracy isn't good or bad. Democracy is a system that if you work it right, liberal democracy, rights for minorities, care for the oppressed and persecuted, then yes, it's a good thing. And he says, ultimately, people pose the question as the conflict between religion and democracy. He says that's not conflict. Because if you have enough people in a country who are a certain religion, then democratically that religion will be the religion of the country. That's not the issue. The conflict is between religion and pluralism. How do you have a liberal democratic society, a pluralistic society that is able to tolerate multiple religions? If we can do that, that's the challenge. And that's the challenge we need to rise to and be able to achieve. He says we already have the answer in the Torah. The Torah says there were people in the world, they gathered together to make a tower, and God said, no, you're going to be separate nations. Bavel, Babylonia, you're now separate nations, the tower after the Tower of Babel. God then chose one of those nations, Abraham and his descendants, to have a certain mission. But he never said that we are the only people or we have a universal message. No, that was a particular message. And there are various nations, and certainly in some of his other books, such as The Dignity of Difference, he expands on this idea. But coming back to the earlier chapter on the moral code and judging my morality versus your morality and who's right, and especially over the last year with toppling of statues, we've been told that what right do we have to impose our values on anyone else? And if you wanted to take that to the extreme, what right do we have to impose our values on the Taliban, on the people of Afghanistan? Answer is, according to the Torah, what Rabbi Sachs would say, there are objective moral values. Yitro was right. Yitro had a system that the Torah said, yes, that's right. That's right, that's objectively right. It wasn't built into the Torah, but we acknowledge that it's right because we are willing to listen to those who have good ideas, Jew or non-Jew. The Taliban are not listening. The Taliban think that it's their way or the highway. And that's why we have to stand up. That's why we have to be opposed to them. That's why we constantly stand back and say, well, you know what, who are we to impose our imperialistic views, colonialism? No. there is right and wrong, and we have every right to stand up for those who are being persecuted, oppressed, women, girls, and so many more in Afghanistan, and we must. Rabbi.
Rabbi Sachs, throughout the book, uses the word covenant. And in terms of living in a liberal democracy that works, there has to be this understood system where there's a covenant. What's a covenant? There's an agreement that you play by certain rules. And we've seen elections in the recent past where the result is challenged to the extent that we might feel that the very rules are being challenged. And democracy can't endure. A society can't endure when that happens. Is democracy good or bad? As Rabbi Sachs says, well, it's neither good nor bad. In a society where they think, and unfortunately today Western nations make this mistake, they think somewhere else can have a democracy. What they don't realize is that the party that wins the majority will take that majority to oppress the minority. And that is not our concept of a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy says the other side win, okay, but they in turn must respect the side that lost. And it's a measure of their status, if you like, whether they live up to those values.
Yes, yes. I know you've prepared another couple of chapters. Let's choose one of them, and then we'll open it to some questions.
Sure. Oh, this is difficult. I will choose one of them. I'll first say that I chose the two that I chose. One of them was Rosh Hashanah because it's coming up, and the other one is Jewish environmental ethics. And I'm going to stick with the latter.
Because you got Rosh Hashanah anyway, you can always use that next week.
For sure. And also the Jewish environmental ethics, well, the whole theme this summer, one of the themes going through this crazy summer that we've endured has, of course, been global warming. So in this chapter, in fact, Rabbi Sachs does not mention global warming. And the reason he doesn't mention it, because I don't think in 1995 any of us were mentioning global warming. So, but let's see what he does say. And again, the theme of collectivism to individualism comes up. How so? Then, because it's another negative impact. The environment, and there's how it suffered the effects of unregulated growth. So you've gone from collectivism to individualism. Everyone does what they like. I'll throw my rubbish where it is. I'll buy whatever car I want, whatever the exhaust emissions are, and my factory, and all the rest of it. Unregulated growth. This chapter, by the way, appeared as an article in the Jewish Chronicle on the 9th of February 1990. So that's 31 years ago. It's 5 years even before the book was printed. So it's a long time ago. No one was talking global warming, but nonetheless, what he says is absolutely relevant to today's discussion. So first of all, he says, environmental questions cannot be answered by conventional economic theory. There's no point in having, the socialists or the capitalists and everything talking about the environment. It doesn't work. The environmental questions pose the ethical dilemma of how to weigh the future against the present. It's about our relationship to nature and our responsibility to posterity, and it places limits on the exploitation of natural resources. And he's very careful to say that the solution is not less science, as some people may propose, but more a far-sighted view of the consequences of further development. What is the Torah approach? So Rabbi Sachs presents three general sources. The first is Bereshit. So there are those who turn to Bereshit 1 with horror and says, fill the earth and subdue it, conquer it, crush it, kivshua, that's what it really means. Ah, so the Torah calls the human domination of the planet. No wonder we're in a mess. Well, that's if you read chapter 1. If you read chapter 2, you see that Adam and Eve were placed in the Garden of Eden, la'ovda u'l'shomra, which means to work it and to guard it. That's very different. In other words, there's a balance. We are allowed to use the world for our benefit. We don't have to leave it exactly as it is. But at the same time, we have to look after it. And l'shomra, he says, to guard it. A guardian has something in their possession, and when they finish with it, they have to hand it back. We're here, limited lifespan, and we, as it were, hand the world back when we leave this world. Do we hand it back in the same position that we received it, or is it the poorer? So that's one perspective of the Torah. But he also says, from the creation chapter, that the Garden of Eden story is a parable for a lesson on the importance of limits. Don't eat forbidden fruit. Some places you just don't go there because the results can be disastrous, as we're beginning to see. The second area of halakha that he draws in from the Torah, and this is actually my favorite, is Shabbat, Shemitah, and Yovel. This is so obvious to me. What is Shabbat? Shabbat is saying there's one day a week we are not going to manipulate the world. We are going to hold back. And I always amused. The one Shabbat that is almost fully observed in Israel is the Shabbat we call Yom Kippur. And they always, first thing in the morning after Yom Kippur, they take a measure of the pollution level. And it is very, very, very low. I'm guessing it's probably the best in the world, just at that point. Can you imagine if the world, instead of trying to run around looking for all sorts of different solutions, which will take many years to come about, stop driving once a week? Can you imagine that? Some cities say, let's have a car-free day. And Rabbi Sachs says, that's what we do all the time. He says, no secular equivalent remotely revivals Shabbat as a day of green consciousness. His words. And the sabbatical year, you let the land lie fallow for a while. That also all contributes to this idea of respecting nature. But the other source that it brings also, and this I did speak about recently, because it came up in the Torah reading, the trees of the field. Don't chop down fruit trees. They're important. And from there we get a general message of what's called bal tashchit. Don't waste. And he points out, we are not allowed to be vandals. We may not vandalize even our own property. He said, people say, ownership, it's mine, I can do with what I like. If I've got this plate and I want to smash it, I'll smash it. Who said I shouldn't? Actually, he says Jewish law says no. Jewish law says no. We're to preserve the world. Wanton destruction, even of our own things, is actually not allowed. And so what came after the book was written about recycling and everything else was very much in tune with the Torah. He tells a story about Choni HaMa'agel, and this I also mentioned in Shul recently. Choni, the circle drawer, many stories about him in the Talmud, but one of them was one day he was walking along and he saw a man planting a carob tree. An old man planting a carob tree. And he said to the fellow, he said, tell me, how long before this carob tree produces fruit? The man said, 70 years. So 70 years, do you think you'll be around to enjoy the fruit of this tree? He said, no. But when I came into the world, I found carob trees with carobs that people who came before me have planted, and I've enjoyed. So I'll do the same for those who come after me. What a powerful message for the environment that we pass on. So just to close this part, where he said, L'ovdal Shomra, this verse in Bereshit, that man was put there to work and guard it. This is put as a quote, and a beautiful midrash on it. I'll tell you where it was put in a moment. But there's a midrash on this which says, God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and he showed them everything in it. He said, take a good look after it, because if you ruin it, there won't be another. There's a beautiful nature reserve in northern Israel, Banyas, well known, beautiful waterfall footpath. As you walk in, if you look carefully, embossed on a stone is this message. It's a nice way of saying keep the place tidy.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Davis. So, it's very enlightening, and like you say, I think Rabbi Sachs, from from an environmental, ecological standpoint, rabbinic standpoint, was way ahead of his time, and hopefully we are listening, because it's not.
We need to listen.
Yes.
We need to listen.
But I want to take just a few minutes of questions from the floor, if anyone does have any questions. Any questions, any thoughts, comments?
If I may. So, if I'm right, the book was written about 25 years ago. So, if Rabbi Sachs, from the Rocha, could write Faith in the Future 2.0 today, having faced what the pandemic has done and restrictions on our civil liberties and what's going on in Afghanistan, what do you think the emphasis might be? Would it be different, or would it be just as it is?
So the question, for those who are viewing, is if Rabbi Sachs were to write Faith in the Future 2.0 today, would the message be the same? Would it be different? And I think, I'll start, and so I think that he did. I think that his latest book, Morality, was that. It was prior to the pandemic. But otherwise, I think that he really honed in on many of his thoughts here. He talks about things like cancel culture, that he was very concerned about, and many of his idea of covenant. He developed the ideas over the years, and I think that in many of his books he focuses on one idea or another idea, and he brought it all together in Morality, thinking that this was the pièce de résistance. I'm not sure what he would add during the pandemic. Certainly, Rabbi Davis spoke about community, and I think that's something that Rabbi Sachs would have been proud of.
He spoke about that quite a lot to us as Rabbanim during the pandemic, the importance of community. He also said something that Rabbi Friedman, you alluded to earlier, that regards to something like Neighborhood Watch, where will we be today without WhatsApp? And he said right at the beginning of the pandemic that God did us a great kindness to give almost the cure before the illness. But the way we have been able to communicate during the pandemic, one of you in the audience commented before, would I see myself doing this 18 months ago? For sure not. But we know right from the word go, we were able to communicate with the entire community via Zoom. Even Rabbi Sachs passing, within about 12 hours of his passing, I made a video and sent it to every member, because I wanted them to know, A, how I felt, B, that they needed to know what we had lost. His message was, by and large, refined and honed, but not significantly changed over the years. His method of presentation was, so yes, he wrote many, many books, but he also so creatively presented via his website different ways of getting the message across to those who couldn't handle the books. And that is a tremendous gift.
Absolutely, and he prepared material that we're still teaching this year.
Yeah.
Any final questions, comments?
I think that the comments on community during the pandemic really resonate. And I think in general society as well. And maybe it was that fact that there was this all-pervading virus that suddenly meant that government was reacting to one thing only, and then community stepped in to the breach, to the gap, and said, okay, the government has set a set of rules, but locally we had the same thing in our street and our area where people were, and we were, saying to old people that we hardly even knew before that lived up the road, do you need anything? And I think it was interesting when government had to step back and people were forced to be local, how community really came to the fore.
Yeah, I think that's
and showed the endemic feelings that people had for their neighbours.
Yeah.
powerful. So the comment was that although Rabbi Sachs is almost begging here for the community feel, sometimes necessity is the mother of all invention, and when human beings needed to, they rallied to the cause and were there for one another.
Can I say, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but Rabbi Sachs had the ear of prime ministers, certainly from Tony Blair onwards. They really respected what he had to say, more than respected. They wanted to know what he had to say. They were on first name terms. Tony Blair used to say, so I would say to my good friend Jonathan, how should we handle this? And he would say, Tony, you need to encourage people to build communities.
Yes. Elizabeth. I'm kidding.
Does it carry on?
No, does he call the Queen Elizabeth?
No, I'm sure not. But the chief rabbi, he called Jonathan. And I think David Cameron as well, when he came into office, they were talking about the big society, and I think that Rabbi Sachs had quite a lot to do with that. It's not the government should help facilitate, but it's the real people living in communities that need to act, to bring themselves together, and to teach the values that we have said before. One of the things that he stresses time and time again, and it was in his chapter on the environment, but also in Rosh Hashanah, which is a much more spiritual chapter, we have received from those who came before us. We now have it in trust. But we are also preparing the way for those that come afterwards. What are we doing spiritually? That's his message from Rosh Hashanah. What are we doing physically? That's the message on the environment. And these were his urgent messages. I am convinced that Rabbi Sachs left the chief rabbinate when he did. He'd reached the official retirement age of 65. He was asked to stay on. But I think he felt very passionately about his messages, the urgency of getting those messages across to the next generation, and that had to be a full-time job.
Yes, and a global job.
And a global job, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Davis. It's been a real privilege to learn with you this evening and to be here in Jigwal Shul. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and wishing everybody a K'tiva B'Chatima Tova, a wonderful, healthy, happy year, only simchas, and may we see the end of all of this terrible decree from above. May we only have goodness in the world.
Amen. Thank you so much, Rabbi Friedman. Wishing you and your family also K'tiva V'Chatima Tova. Should be a year of blessing and tremendous hatzlacha.
Amen.
And what you do. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
We can breathe.
I think